So this is Manullah Lochinwall, and he's the suspected gunman who attacked these two National Guardsmen in Washington, D.C., right by the White House. This woman, Sarah Beckstrom, was a victim. And this guy, Andrew Wolf, they were both from West Virginia. Seems like Andrew's going to be all right, or at least he's going to make it through. But anyway, Trump is now saying that he's going to pause all asylum decisions, so I thought it was worth us getting into this for a second, basically see what the facts are and the context, and I think it's interesting and it poses an important question for us, honestly. So anyway, this guy drove across the country, seems like about 3,000 miles, basically right by the White House to do this. But then honestly, the plot kind of thickens because it turns out that he was part of these CIA Zero units. So what are these things? They're basically these counterterrorism units that we used in Afghanistan to target senior members of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They work directly for the US government, and we gave them military training, and we wanted them especially to conduct these night raids, which I gather were like pretty intense. And this guy, turns out he was part of this Unit 3, the Kandahar Strike Force, which is honestly one of the supposedly most elite units of these Zero units because it operated in one of the most dangerous and important parts of Afghanistan. And apparently he served for like 10 years. So anyway, when the Afghan war ends and Biden starts to pull out of Afghanistan, it looks like there were people in Afghanistan advocating for people like this dude who had just served 10 years doing some intense stuff for us. And there was even a dedicated team to help them settle in the US. But we also took a lot of biometric data on all these people. We also subjected them to polygraphs and looked specifically for anti-American sentiment as best we could, I guess. And this reporting here was all in the New York Times, and honestly, I'm always a little sus of the New York Times. But it's corroborated by the Free Press, which I think is a little more reliable in this case. And this article was written by somebody who was in one of these Zero units, and the writer says that the suggestion that this guy was not vetted is definitely not true. He said the same thing, background checks, polygraph, same deal, and apparently this guy, he served under both the Obama and Trump administrations in Afghanistan, and also he got his initial pardon was approved by Biden, which was kind of his first permission to be in the United States. It's not like a pardon for a crime. It was like basically enables him to come while his application is processed. And then under the Trump administration, his application did get processed. But it is clear that the government has identified that there were a lot of problems vetting these people coming from Afghanistan after the Afghan war was like winding down. So this is the Office of the Inspector General, which is relatively independent. And it seems like basically there was a lot of information that people within the military had that wasn't shared with other departments in government. And it made it hard for them to make good decisions about who they should let into the United States from Afghanistan. And there's another interesting wrinkle to come, but like basically it's like, here's an example of it didn't work. This CIA guard basically was said to be vetted, turns out to be not true. His name was Nasir Ahmad, and basically we let in basically 100,000 of these people from Afghanistan. It was called Operation Allies Welcome. So it's supposed to be like people who helped us out in the Afghan war. So this guy, Nasir Ahmad, was supposedly vetted, all those things, moves to Oklahoma City, becomes a Lyft driver, and then basically tries to carry out a terrorist plot in the name of ISIS. And actually, then there was an internal report by the government, and they released this data that showed that during this Operation Allies Welcome, there was a bunch of problems, including about over 5,000 people who we knew were likely national security concerns. So of 100,000, like 5%, that's honestly a little bad ratio for my taste. So now basically Trump decided to halt all asylum decisions, and he's also firing these immigration court. They're not judges, they're like administrative judges. They're a little different, but these basically people who run these immigration courts, if they don't basically get on board with what he wants, which is to, deny a lot of claims and get illegal immigrants out of the country. And I think one thing that could be a little bit suspicious is that the way we collect crime data is a little funny. So one of the things is that if you're from the Middle East and you commit a crime, you're labeled as white in the crime statistics. So like this dude, an Afghan national who was doing some crazy stuff in Fort Worth, and that area requires a race selection. And honestly, I've done a lot of videos on how trying to define race is silly and there's no basis for it, but whatever. We require a race selection, but look at the options: white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic. And it's kind of the same thing in the FBI crime database. So we actually have a hard time tracking like exactly how much of the people that came in through Operation Allies Welcome have contributed to some of these big events. And maybe you haven't seen my video on how these undocumented commercial truck drivers who are getting in crashes on the interstate, just conveniently, we don't collect data on their immigration status or which country they're from. And like, maybe it's just 'cause it's hard to collect that data and our systems are old, but also it's like, then you could never really tell whether, you know, there is a trend there. So anyway, now the government is trying to overhaul how we do all that, but it looks like this is delayed. This was October of this year, so they're trying to figure out how to collect this data, I guess. But I honestly think that the case of this guy shows a profound moral hazard, which is like, so we asked them to use extreme violence to help us out with our war aims in Afghanistan. They're the tip of the spear. This guy's going on crazy, intense night raids, which I read about, and I didn't want to include the details in this video. And it seems like, you know, it was intense for him to come to America. He has PTSD from all this stuff. So it's like, what do we do? Do we let this person come into the United States, or do we force them to stay in a country where we basically just lost a war, or at least pulled out, and they've been doing all this heinous stuff to the now rulers of that country? I mean, honestly, it's a tough moral question.